The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom has come out to great acclaim, broadly speaking, and I've been loving the game, but there is one part of Tears of the Kingdom some people have been noting that is inescapable for it. It's a Nintendo Switch game. Now, the Nintendo Switch is a console that came out all the way back in 2017, and was considered a weak piece of kit even for that year, and it's now 2023. And for an action open world RPG game, yeah, that weaker hardware is definitely a noticeable part of the experience. Now, your tolerance for stuff like this will boil down to your own subjective preferences, but let's try and break this down, if you will. And let's start off with, in my opinion, the most important aspect of the game's performance, the FPS, otherwise known as frames per second. Now, this game runs at around 30 FPS, unless you're in a crowded or cluttered area, in which case the FPS can dip. It's very similar to Breath of the Wild in that regard. Now, personally, I'm someone who does value FPS. It is an objective measure. So long as your game wasn't coated on a baked potato, and you space your frames out evenly enough, more frames means the game is more reactive, because you have more information to deal with, since you're going from 30 frames a second to 60 frames a second, or even higher. The importance of having those additional frames can vary upon the genre. Let's take a turn-based action game like Persona or Honkai Star Rail. You aren't getting much of a mechanical advantage by having higher frame rates, since the combat itself is not predicated on your reaction timing. I'd argue higher frames still look better and feel better, especially when navigating the world, unless the game is going for a very specific style where a lower frame rate is required for it to work. Total Biscuit used to bring up the old South Park games, which would utilize a lower frame rate to emulate the feeling of the show, because that's the aesthetic that the game was looking for. So think of things like that. Now, Tears of the Kingdom, like we've talked about, is an open-world action game. You will be exploring this grand world of Hyrule and the sky and the underground, while also engaging in real-time combat. I normally push back a bit on the crowd that try and state that 30 FPS is unplayable, because, well, it is playable. Whether it's preferable would be a separate option. Now, obviously, Tears of the Kingdom doesn't have much of an option, right? It's a Switch exclusive, so it has to work with what it's got. It's merely an unfortunate circumstance for the developers that they are limited by the hardware that they are being presented with. But for the consumer, the distinction is negligible, and honestly, irrelevant. Now, I'm not saying don't buy the game or don't play it because it's not a cutting-edge game from the performance department, but what I am saying is, this is information that is available to you, the consumer, who, when equipped with adequate knowledge and context, can make your own informed decision about whether or not you think picking up Tears or continuing to play it is worth the effort. For me, it is. I'm really enjoying the game as a whole, and the customization that the new mechanics such as Ultra Hand and Fuse have introduced into the formula really makes the game stand out for me. It will probably end up being in contention for my Game of the Year. That's how much I'm enjoying the game. But around these parts of the internet, we have this weird thing we like to call context and nuance. Oh no, all the horror, nuance, in my internet discussion? Blech, disgusting! Now, context and nuance are two words, not counting and, that I'm pretty sure would turn most of the internet into blood-sucking hellspawn, hell-bent on stamping out any such notion that an argument or opinion could possibly not be one of two distinct positions. Now, it is true. I would enjoy the game more if it were at 60 FPS or even higher. There's a distinction in this conversation that I tend to find gets lost in the weeds of argument on this issue. Having a higher frame rate makes the game more reactive, unless, like I said before, the game is coded by Abe Simpson. But that's an extreme situation that for the purposes of this video I'll disregard, since it's exceedingly rare, at least in my opinion and experience. But your perception of whether or not the game plays better as a result of that is subjective preference. The objective reality is that higher frame rates, again, unless your game is like a turn-based RPG or something, but even then they still kind of apply here, those higher frame rates makes the game smoother and more responsive. Again, let's also discount the notion of lag or input delay as a result of streaming a game or whatever, because that's a separate aspect affecting the performance outside of the frame rate. And even then, higher frame rates would still increase the performance a bit. Once you play games at a higher frame rate, the difference between 30 and 60 or 30 and 144 God forbid, from both a mechanical input and visual standpoint is glaring. Now, whether or not you enjoy that, that's the subjective element. Personally, I do. I prefer having higher frame rates. I prefer having a game be more responsive. Despite this, and despite being someone who all the time, outside of exceedingly rare circumstances, always prefers those higher frame rates, I can still enjoy Tears of the Kingdom, and enjoy it more than other games that are at higher frame rates, because the game itself is so well crafted and executed. Do the performance drops affect my enjoyment? Absolutely. They are jarring to me, and take me out of it and do harm to my immersion. Do they ruin the overall game for me? No. And this is where that nuance and context come into play. You can have critique with a game, but still overall really enjoy it. Just because you point one thing out doesn't mean that the entire experience is tarnished because of it. Irreparably so. And funnily enough, here's like a brief aside. There's another thing some games can do that annoys the hell out of me, and that is tying the game logic to the frame rate. And if you don't know what that means, if you uncap the frame rate on certain games and push it higher than it's intended, the game just speeds up and plays like it's being fast-forwarded. And the same thing can happen in the other direction, where lower frame rates than intended slow the game down. Nier Replicant, when it came to PC, had that issue. And I even talked about that when it first came out. That's just generally, in my opinion, god-awful coding, and an issue that I don't believe Tears of the Kingdom suffers from. But let's move on from the frame rate. Let's move on to another angle to the game being on the Switch. The graphics. Yeah, they aren't cutting edge. Yeah, they look way worse than a lot of contemporary games on other systems. But here's my angle on it. I still think the game looks beautiful. Now, why is that? Because Tears of the Kingdom relies more on the aspects of a game's visual design that I find personally important. That being the art style and the lighting. Sure, the lighting isn't cutting edge or anything, but it's good enough to create beautiful vistas and to paint a scene quite enchantingly. And the art style itself relies a lot on color and overall color saturation and varying that up to produce different experiences. It's an interesting thing that they do, right? Where in the sky, everything just looks extremely saturated and colorful. It's honestly a beautiful scene when you are navigating those sky islands, especially in the intro zone. Then you get down to Hyrule and it's slightly less saturated on the whole in my experience, but still pretty in its own way, and the changing weather effects can help create visual experiences that differ from one another. Then you go to the underground, and things are far darker and danker. And even when you get some light going, the color palette is very muted and unsaturated, outside of the red from Gloom. It's a distinct visual that varies up the experience that keeps me visually engaged with the game. These three layers create unique visual experiences that to me keep my attention while looking beautiful in their own way, despite not being cutting edge graphically speaking. Because the game nails the aspects that I personally find important, that being a sense of color and the lighting. The game also has a great sense of scale to it. Breath of the Wild always had a great sense of horizontal scale to it, with its rolling fields of Hyrule and large open world. But with Tears, we also gain a sense of verticality, with the underground and the sky, which just add to the grandeur of it all, for me. And I just find myself being sucked into it all over again. No, not that kind of sucked. There's some counter-arguments you can make about this, but we'll cover it in a separate video. But for me, this discussion is entirely subjective as to whether or not the visuals of Hyrule appeal to you. Could it look better on better hardware, have better texture resolution, just overall graphical fidelity? Sure, absolutely. But do I think the game is still gorgeous in its own right, especially for the Switch? Absolutely again. A game's performance can sometimes be a tough discussion to have. People get weirdly defensive about the plastic box they bought and want to pretend that it can do no harm, or try and defend their position, whether attacking another console or defending their own, using absolutes and binary argumentation as a way to justify their purchase. It's okay to admit the Switch's performance is not as good, and that a game like Tears could greatly benefit from more powerful hardware, but the Switch also has its own unique advantages, like being able to be a mobile device, and for being available at a cheaper price than consoles like the Xbox or PlayStation, or high-end PC. So yeah, would I enjoy the game more on more powerful tech? Absolutely. Do I still love the game and think it's going to end up as one of my favorite games this year? Again, yeah, absolutely. It is of my opinion that both of these ideas and notions can coexist, and whether or not you may want to pick up Tears of the Kingdom may depend on what your preferences are, and if stuff like this game's performance will be a deal breaker for you or not. So do your research, be vigilant, be a good consumer, and make smart consumer practices. And if at the end of the day you want to play the game or you not want to play, go right on ahead. You do what you want to do. Just make sure you are equipped with the knowledge that's adequate enough for you so you can make those informed decisions. Personally though, I'm really enjoying Tears of the Kingdom, and I'm probably going to continue to enjoy it quite a while more. Thank you all for tuning in. My pleasure making the video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe. It really helps channel out and helps support future content, and I greatly appreciate it. And hit the bell icon to be notified when I upload and stream in the future. Stay safe, have a great day, and I hope to see you all again next time, everybody. Go play some video games. Bye-bye, everybody, until we meet again.